you're in IDV Twitter, you've probably seen this tag a good amount of times. Hernarich is basically the pairing of Hernando, Romero, which is the matador, and Richard Sterling, which is the knight. Why? We are about to find out. It's not that they're both pretty or that they're both new, but it's actually because they are a psychological match. Welcome to the Identity 5 Psychology office. Today we are analyzing Hernarich. Alright, let's get into it. So the pairing is often interpreted through fandom analysis as a psychological contrast dynamic, but a closer reading reveals something more specific. Now we have both characters that are fundamentally shaped by identity formation under external social pressure, but they develop in opposite directions. Now, Richard Sterling's identity was formed through substitution, concealment, and rewriting. Hernando was formed through audience validation, fear conditioning, and performance escalation. Richard constructs identity to hide instability, and Hernando constructs identity to survive instability. Let's talk about Richard Sterling. So Richard's psychological profile is best understood through identity substitution trauma and narrative control behavior. Now, the core traits of this include identity ambiguity, which increases imposter replacement framework. We have chronic narrative manipulation, which is rewriting perception of events and people. Psychological containment, which is effects of suppression in favor of presentation. And control-oriented cognition, which is reducing unpredictability through structure. Now, we all know what happened with the Sterlings. We have Richard Sterling who ran away or something, got lost, and then we have Dimitri, which is highly theorized as Richard's real name, who was groomed by a peddler to become Richard Sterling, as payback or revenge, and to get the money, all that. So Richard basically has never been himself a day in his life. So basically, Richard does not develop identity organically, he develops it through replacement logic. Like, if identity is unstable, it can be rebuilt through performance. This produces a selfhood model where authenticity is irrelevant, emotional truth is secondary to narrative stability. It's not that he's deceptive, he's dependent, basically, on constructed continuity to function psychologically. He's not purely evil, he's just a little wonky. Now, the central tension in Richard's psychology is, am I the person I present, or the person who replaces what was missing? Unresolved ambiguity creates chronic identity pressure, which he manages through secrecy and narrative editing. Alright, let's get into Hernando Romero. So we have Hernando's psychological structure is built on fear conditioning and external validation of danger-based performance. Now, his core traits of this are early trauma response to death exposure, which is fear to rejection, rejection to correction. We have behavioral conditioning through shame and praise cycles, identity reinforcement through audience praise and reaction, and sensation seeking linking to survival emotion. So fear becomes a stimulation, basically. Now, Hernando does not stabilize identity internally, he stabilizes it externally. I become myself when I am seen surviving danger is basically the framework. This produces a selfhood model where identity requires an audience and fear is converted into adrenaline-based affirmation and performance replaces introspection. Now let's get into the internal conflict. The central tension in Hernando's psychology is, if I am not watched in danger, do I still exist as I am? This creates dependency on, risk and social attention and performance validation. Without these, his identity destabilizes. Now, what about their interactions? What about their dynamics? Analyzed together, this pairing does not function as emotional compatibility. It functions as competing identity systems. Now, Richard's effect on Hernando can be, stated as controlled emotional presentation, removing predictable feedback loops. Hernando's performance psychology depends on reaction and recognition, and the result of both those is instability or escalation in performance intensity. Now, Hernando's effect on Richard. It can be stated as Hernando introduces unpredictable behavioral intensity, Richard's identity system relies on managing narrative predictability, and the result of both of those is an increased need for control, interpretation, or distancing. So the interaction basically is a controlled identity system, which is Richard, meets a performance-dependent identity system, which is Hernando. And neither system fully resolves the other. Now, the key psychological contrast. What's the contrast? Well, it's construction versus exhibition. The core distinction between them is not morality or personality, it's how their identity stays maintained. Now, Richard's identity is constructed internally and protected externally by pretending, basically, by being that actor. He does not know who he is when if he were to drop the act right now, who would he be? He doesn't know. He has not been himself for a long time. Now, Hernando, his identity is produced externally through observation and through feeling. Perception is necessary for selfhood. He needs that audience. Truth is shaped through performance and reactions. He needs the constant praise and the constant affirmation. Richard says, I must control how I am understood, while Hernando says, I must be seen in order to be real. This creates a fundamental mismatch in identity logic. Now, you put both of these together, and they both have identity issues. Why did the fandom interpret them as compatible? Despite their structural differences, the pairing does persist because it produces a rare psychological pattern, like psychological interaction. There's mutual identity disruption. Richard disrupts Hernando's reliance on audience response, and Hernando disrupts Richard's ability to fully control the perception of himself. Now, the feedback loop instability is neither character provides stable reinforcement for the other's identity system, and this creates ongoing tension rather than a resolution. Now, the symbolic symmetry is that both characters are shaped by external forces, defined through survival mechanisms, and dependent on systems beyond internal self-definition. Now, Richard Sterling's identity is controlled reconstruction. Hernando's identity is performed survival under observation. When placed in the same interpretive space, they do not complete each other at all. They challenge the foundations of how each defines self. This is why the dynamic remains psychologically compelling, not because they understand each other, but because they expose the instability in how the other exists. Now, what about the understand each other without talking theory? One of the most common interpretations is that they don't need interaction to be psychologically compatible. Those who support this reading tend to frame Richard as emotionally unreadable, identity fragmented, and socially curated, and Hernando as instinct-driven, perceptive under pressure, and reactive to intensity rather than emotion. So the argument becomes they would recognize each other's patterns instantly. From a psychological standpoint, this is less about emotional bonding and more about mutual pattern recognition bias. The idea that two complex individuals can feel connected simply because they detect structure in each other's behavior. Now, what about Hernando would break the mask theory? What about Hernando can break Richard's mask? He can fix him. I can fix him. Now, this view of the fandom narrative says Richard maintains control through presentation. Hernando disrupts control through exposure. Therefore, Hernando would unravel Richard over time. People often describe Hernando as someone who sees through people without trying, but what's interesting here is that the interpretation slightly overstates Hernando's role as an exposer. Based on his psychology, he's not fully focused on truth-seeking, he's focused on thrill and reinforcement through danger. So if anything, this theory reflects more about the fascination with truth-breaking characters than it does about Hernando's actual internal motivation. Now, what about they're just the same, just inverted theory? The most popular analytical interpretation would be this one, is that they're both the same, they're just in two different ways. Fans frame them as Richard equals identity through control, and Hernando is identity through exposure. Richard's identity's instability is rooted in replacement, and Hernando's is rooted in fear conditioning. They are not the same wound inverted. They are different survival systems entirely. What about they would escalate each other theory? This one's actually the closest to psychological accuracy. Interpret the pairing as Richard increases narrative control when destabilized, and Hernando increases intensity when observed, so neither provides emotional grounding at all. Instead of soft compatibility, we imagine escalation loops, tension cycles, unstable equilibrium. This aligns more with how the characters are written on a psychological level, especially Hernando's reinforcement through risk pattern. And we all know Richard probably is a little crazy. He's got a sword and everything, and he still wears that helmet, and he wears a gauntlet, so that won't end well. Now, we're going to wrap this up with the most interesting part is that the pairing is less about who they are individually, but how different identity systems behave when placed under mutual observation. Some see conflict, some see personal meetings, but underneath all of it, the consistent thread is that both characters destabilize each other's methods of existing. And that's where the fandom tension sticks. It's not because of compatibility, but because of the interpretive tension that never fully resolves. Alright, now the psychological significance of this pairing does not lie in compatibility, but in collision between an identity built through concealment and an identity built through exposure, neither of which can remain unchanged under mutual observation. And that wraps up the Hernando and Richard video. Once we get some more lore on Matador, I will probably be remaking this video. They're one of the most interesting pairs. So let me know who you'd like to see a video on next, what pairings you'd like me to analyze next. And that's all.